Adrian Carter read people the way some men read balance sheets. Quickly, precisely, and without sentiment. It was a habit he had developed early. Long before the money, long before the company bore his name in the footer of 12,000 employee paychecks. You learned to read people when you grew up in a house where the heat sometimes stopped working in January, and nobody said anything about it directly. You learned to notice what wasn't being said. You learned that the way a man held his shoulders told you more about his intentions than the words coming out of his mouth. He was 44 years old. He had a daughter in 7th grade who still left sticky notes on his coffee mug in the morning, and he had not remarried after Sarah's death 3 years ago. And he did not particularly care what strangers at airports thought of his travel attire. He was wearing dark jeans, a gray thermal Henley, and the kind of worn leather shoes that looked like they'd been resoled twice. He had a canvas duffel under the seat in front of him. He was in seat 2A, first class, on a Tuesday morning flight from Chicago O'Hare to LaGuardia, reading a physical copy of a quarterly infrastructure report that his assistant had printed and spiral-bound for him, because he still preferred paper when he was thinking. The woman who would change the shape of that morning was already seated when he boarded. Her name was Sloane Whitfield, and she had the posture of someone who had practiced it. Late 30s, tailored ivory blazer, a glass of champagne she hadn't touched yet balanced on the tray table beside her, a laptop open to a presentation deck that she minimized quickly when she noticed him stop at row 2. She looked at him. Then she looked at the seat beside her. Then she looked at him again, and in the space of that second look, Adrian had already read everything he needed to know. He had seen that expression before, not often in the last decade, but enough times before that to recognize it immediately. It was the expression that preceded a specific kind of request. He settled into 2B, tucked the duffel, set the report on his knee. Sloane Whitfield did not speak immediately. She waited until the gate agent made the pre-boarding completion announcement, and then she pressed the call button above her head with one manicured finger. The flight attendant, a composed woman whose name tag read Diane, appeared within 30 seconds. "I'd like to discuss a seating issue," Sloane said, her voice pleasantly modulated, the kind of pleasantly modulated that had been calibrated to get results without appearing difficult. Diane waited. "I have a meeting to prepare for, and I work better with more space. I was under the impression that the seat next to me might remain open." "The flight is full today, ma'am," Diane said. "I understand that." Sloane's eyes moved briefly to Adrian, then away. "I was hoping there might be a different arrangement possible. Another seat perhaps for one of us." Diane looked at Adrian. "Sir, do you have your boarding pass available?" Adrian reached into his front pocket and produced it without expression. Diane glanced at it, handed it back. "You're in the correct seat, sir." She turned back to Sloane with the particular patience of a person who had navigated this category of situation many times. "The cabin is full, ma'am. Is there anything I can get you?" Sloane said no. She lifted her champagne and turned back toward her laptop. Adrian opened his report to page 7. For the next 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. The plane pushed back, taxied, lifted. The city fell away beneath cloud cover, and Adrian had moved through roughly 12 pages when Sloane's phone buzzed against her tray table. She glanced at it, made a small sound he might have interpreted as irritation, and began typing quickly. He did not look over. He had no interest in her screen. What he was thinking about, when he wasn't reading, was a meeting scheduled for Thursday at 9 in the morning in a conference room on the 41st floor of a building on 6th Avenue. It was a board meeting, technically, though the word implied a formality that had never quite fit the company he'd built from an office above a hardware store in Evanston. When he was 26 years old, Caldwell Group had grown steadily, deliberately, in the manner of a structure built to last rather than to impress quickly. 31 states, industrial logistics, supply chain architecture, and in the last 4 years, a move into commercial property infrastructure that had added weight to the balance sheet in ways that were not yet fully visible from the outside. He owned 68%. The remaining 32% was distributed between 2 early investors, a handful of senior partners, and 1 outside shareholder whose entry had been arranged quietly 18 months ago during a capital expansion that nobody had made noise about. Adrian preferred it that way. He had no interest in being photographed. He had given exactly 2 interviews in the past decade, both for trade publications that his daughter had never heard of, and he intended to keep his profile exactly where it was. He turned another page. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, he heard Sloane exhale. She had been working steadily, the laptop keys clicking at intervals, and now she stopped. He could see without fully turning his head that she had closed the lid. "Long flight," she said. It took him a moment to realize she was speaking to him. He looked up. 2 hours and 20 minutes, he said, and returned to the report. A pause, then, "What are you reading?" He held up the cover briefly. Infrastructure Quarterly. She nodded with the slight widening of eyes that indicated she had not expected that. "Work?" she asked. "Something like that." Another silence. He could feel her recalibrating. People who had dismissed you and then wanted to walk it back always went through a recognizable recalibration period. He did not hold it against her. He had seen it too many times to find it interesting. "I'm sorry," she said, quietly enough that it cost her something. "Earlier. That was unnecessary." Adrian set the report on his knee again. He looked at her directly for the first time since boarding. "It was," he said, not unkindly. She held the eye contact. "I had a difficult morning. That's not an excuse, She stopped. "I don't usually do that." "Okay," he said. She seemed to expect more from that, and when more didn't come, she gave a short, dry laugh. "You're not going to make this easy. I wasn't aware it was my job to." She laughed again, more genuine this time, and something in her posture shifted slightly, the calibrated straightness giving way by a degree. She held out her hand. "Sloane Whitfield," she said. "I'm an executive director at Caldwell Group, head of commercial development." Adrian looked at her hand. He shook it. "What division?" he asked. She named it. He knew the division. He had approved its restructuring 14 months ago after a mid-year review that suggested the previous organizational model was generating unnecessary friction between regional teams. The restructuring had worked. Commercial development was now one of their 3 strongest performing verticals. "How long?" he asked. 3 years with the company. Before that, I was at Greystone Partners." She tilted her head. "What about you? What do you do?" "Operations," he said, which was true in the general sense. She asked a few more questions, the way people do when they're genuinely curious, but also performing a kind of professional triage, sorting incoming strangers into useful and not useful categories. He answered simply, without embellishment. He mentioned logistics. He mentioned supply chain. He did not mention Evanston, or the hardware store, or the quiet office above it, where he had worked 14-hour days for 3 years before the first real contract came in. At some point, somewhere over Indiana, he estimated, Sloane ordered coffee and asked if he wanted anything. He said water. She flagged Diane. They talked in the way 2 professionals talk when they've decided, mutually and without announcement, to stop being strangers. She was intelligent. He had expected that. She was also, beneath the blazer and the posture and the morning's poor instincts, observant in the way that suggested she had earned her position rather than navigated into it. She asked questions that went one layer deeper than most people's questions. She listened to the answers. He noticed that she had relaxed her shoulders completely by the time they crossed into Ohio airspace. "You're heading to the city for work?" she asked. "Board meeting Thursday," he said. She nodded slowly. "Used to, actually. Big one." She didn't elaborate, but he could see the shape of a private concern in the way she looked out the window for a moment. "There's been some movement in ownership in the last year. Not all of it announced. I don't know who some of these people are." She paused. "That makes me nervous." "I like knowing who I'm working with. That's reasonable," he said. "Is it?" She turned back toward him with a slight tilt of her head. "My VP thinks I'm being paranoid. Says it doesn't matter who owns what as long as the structure performs." "Your VP is wrong," Adrian said mildly. She looked at him. "You sound certain about that." "Ownership isn't a formality," he said. "It's a philosophy. It tells you where decisions will come from when things get difficult." Sloane was quiet for a moment. "You're not in operations," she said finally, in the tone of someone who had just finished adding a column of numbers. "I said operations," he said. "I didn't say only operations." She stared at him for 3 seconds. He watched her thinking. He watched the thought arrive. "What's your last name?" she said. "Carter," he said. The color left her face in a very specific and immediate way. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just a clean, quiet draining, the way a room looks when someone turns off a light. "Adrian Carter," she said. He said nothing. She set her coffee cup down very carefully on the tray table. She looked at her hands for a moment, then at the closed laptop, then at the window, and then at him. "You own 68% of Caldwell Group," she said. It was not a question. 68 and change, he said, depending on the quarter. Sloane Whitfield did not say anything for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady in the way that required effort to keep steady. "I asked the flight attendant to move you. You did. I didn't know who you were." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." She looked at the window again. Outside, cloud cover had broken and the grid of an Ohio city, Columbus, he thought, based on timing, was visible below them, the highways cutting clean lines through the winter brown. "Are you going to fire me?" she said. Still not a question. "Should I?" he asked. She didn't flinch from the question. He noticed that. She turned back toward him and met his eyes, and she did not offer him a performance of remorse or an inventory of her accomplishments. She just said quietly, "No, I don't think you should. I'm very good at my job. And what I did this morning was wrong in a way that has nothing to do with my job." He considered that. "I know you're good at your job," he said. "I read the mid-year development report. The West Coast commercial expansion was your proposal." Something moved across her face, surprise, briefly, then something more complicated. "You read the mid-year," she stopped. "Of course, you did. The methodology was sound," he said. "The execution timeline was aggressive, but it held. It held because I didn't sleep for 6 weeks," she said, and then immediately looked as though she hadn't intended to say that. He almost smiled. He kept it contained. "That's not something you need to tell your employer," he said. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." They were quiet for a while. The plane moved through clear air over the Appalachians, the view sharp and cold-looking and very blue. Adrian had put down the infrastructure report entirely now. There was something in this situation he found genuinely interesting, in the way a problem with an unexpected variable becomes interesting. Not the variable itself, but what it revealed about the system around it. Sloane Whitfield was not the first person to make that error. She would not be the last. The error had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with a category of assumption that was invisible to the person making it, which was precisely what made it so persistent. He thought about his daughter's sticky notes on the coffee mug. Last week's had read, "Don't be a grumpy man today." He had kept it there until the adhesive gave out. "How long have you been with the company?" he asked. 3 years, she said, and then hearing herself repeat it, "I told you that already." "You did," he said. "I'm asking differently." He paused. "What keeps you there?" She thought about that for a moment. Not the reflex answer. He waited for the reflex to pass and watched her arrive at the real one. "The work has weight," she said finally. "Some companies, you close a deal and it just," she moved one hand, "moves numbers. Caldwell, when something closes, you can see it. Physical things. Buildings, routes, supply chains. It changes what a city looks like in 5 years." She looked at him. "I like that. I like building things that last." Adrian said nothing for a moment. "The company started above a hardware store," he said. "There was a loading dock behind it. We used to track shipments on a whiteboard with dry erase markers." He paused. "I still have the whiteboard." Sloane stared at him. "You're serious," she said. "It's in the storage room on the 41st floor. My assistant wants to throw it out. I've told her 3 times not to." For the first time in the entire flight, Sloane Whitfield laughed in a way that did not have any strategy in it. The fasten seatbelt sign came on. The pilot's voice noted they were beginning descent into the New York area, and the local time was 11:47, and the temperature in the city was 31 degrees. Sloane folded the trays table up. She sat back. After a moment she said, without looking at him, "I'm going to be in that board meeting Thursday." "I know," he said. "And you're going to be there?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Is this going to be a problem?" she asked. The question was professional and direct, and he respected it. "That depends on you," he said. "Not on Thursday. Thursday is just a meeting. I mean over time." She turned to look at him. "The assumption you made this morning," he said, "is a useful one to understand. Not to punish you with, to understand. Because it tells you something about the lens you're operating with. And the lens matters in commercial development more than almost any other function. You're reading rooms. You're reading counterparties. You're reading partners." He paused. "The same instinct that made you press that call button this morning can make you misread a negotiation." Sloane was very still. "That's not a warning," he continued. "It's what I would tell any director-level person in the company who had something to fix. The question is whether you're the kind of person who fixes it, or the kind who rationalizes it." She didn't answer immediately. The plane descended through cloud cover, the windows going gray, and the landing gear made its mechanical sound beneath them. "Which do you think I am?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "This morning, in isolation, doesn't tell me enough. The West Coast proposal tells me more." He looked out the window. "People are usually more than their worst moment, but they're also more than their best work." The wheels found the runway. The cabin decelerated in that sudden pressing way that always felt more abrupt than you expected. Nobody spoke during the taxi to the gate. When the seatbelt sign extinguished and the passengers began the ritual of the overhead bins, Sloane stood and reached for her bag. Adrian remained seated, in no hurry. He was thinking about the Thursday meeting, about the ownership question she'd raised without knowing she was raising it, about the whiteboard in the storage room on 41 that his assistant kept suggesting they donate to something. Sloane paused in the aisle. "For what it's worth," she said, and her voice was quiet in the way of something said carefully. "I knew it was wrong before Diane came back, not because of who you were, just wrong." He looked up at her. "I know," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and moved toward the forward door. Adrian picked up his infrastructure report and folded it under his arm and waited for the aisle to clear. Outside the terminal, the cold came in hard off the street. He found a car waiting, the driver holding a sign that said nothing, just a number, and he put the duffel in the trunk and got in and looked at the midday city moving past the windows. His phone showed a text from his daughter. It said, "Did you eat breakfast or did you just drink coffee again?" He texted back, "Ate." She sent back a single skeptical emoji. He turned his phone face down on the seat and looked out at the expressway and thought about what Sloane Whitfield had said at 30,000 feet, that she liked building things that lasted, that there was weight in the work, that you could see the shape of it in 5 years if you did it right. He had spent the better part of 20 years thinking the same thing, usually in the dark of an office that nobody else knew he was sitting in, with a cup of coffee and a whiteboard, and the particular silence of a building that had already closed for the night. He had not built the company to be seen. He had built it because the alternative was building nothing, and that had never been an option he could seriously entertain. Thursday's meeting would proceed as scheduled. There would be an agenda and minutes and a round table with water pitchers at intervals, and the people in those chairs with varying amounts of information and varying amounts of stake in the outcome. He would sit at the head of the table, which was where he always sat, and no one in that room would look at him the way Sloane Whitfield had looked at him on the jetway that morning, as if he were something that didn't belong in the space he occupied. And if they did, he thought, looking out at the gray December city pressing itself against the windows of the car, he would read it the way he read everything else, precisely without sentiment, and with the patience of a man who had learned a long time ago that belonging was not something another person got to decide for you. The car moved through traffic toward Manhattan. He opened the report back to page 7.